Today is the second Sunday, or this weekend we celebrate the second Sunday in Ordinary Time. And I often say this when I'm talking about Ordinary Time, but Ordinary Time in the church calendar does not mean ordinary in the sense that we usually use the word as like boring or routine or unremarkable. Ordinary time is anything but ordinary. During Ordinary Time, we hear about the parts of Jesus' life that are not associated with Christmas and Easter. And so we'll be hearing about the things that Jesus did during this time of the year, specifically his teaching and the miracles that he worked, the meat of the Gospels, and where the church asks us to recall the life and ministry of Jesus. And those things are definitely not ordinary. But the reason the church calls this season Ordinary Time has nothing to do with the normal use of the word ordinary, because the church is much older than our modern use of modern language. The church uses the word ordinary in its original meaning. We get the church word ordinary from the Latin word ordinis, which means an order or a rank. The word ordinis can mean something that is arranged in a row. You can see how over centuries this word slowly has transformed. If something is straight, arranged in a row, you can see how that can be transformed into meaning something like commonplace or boring. But the idea that I want to get across is that ordinary essentially means that it's ordered. And by that I mean that it's numbered. If you think back to your math classes, ordinal numbers are numbers that appear in a sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And so since the Christmas season ended last Sunday, last week was the first week of Ordinary Time. We will, of course, move into the second week of Ordinary Time this week. And we'll have a total of 34 weeks of Ordinary Time throughout the course of this coming year. We'll, of course, take a break from Ordinary Time for the seasons of Lent and Easter, but we'll pick right back up with where we left off in the summer. So if you add the 4 weeks of Advent, the 2 weeks of Christmas, the 6 weeks of Lent, the 7 weeks of Easter, and the 34 weeks of Ordinary Time, you get the entire church year. Which is, of course, it adds up to 53 weeks, which it would take me even longer to explain how we end up with 53 weeks instead of 52, but the short of it is that Easter doesn't always fall on the same day every year, and Christmas rarely falls on a Sunday, so some things kind of get mixed up. During Ordinary Time, nearly all of the Gospels that are read at weekend masses, they come from the same one of the 4 Gospels. This year, the Gospel readings during Ordinary Time are all pretty much from St. Mark's Gospel. And to me, it is always a good idea each year at the beginning of Ordinary Time to familiarize ourselves with the Gospel that we'll be hearing from for over the course of the next 10 months. You might have noticed, though, if you're paying attention, you might say, well, Father, we just heard from the Gospel of St. John, not St. Mark. I know it's kind of bad timing on my part, but that brings me to the first point about the Gospel according to Mark, and that is that St. Mark's Gospel is by far the shortest of the 4 Gospels. It is very efficient in its use of words. It gets right in, tells the story, and ends it without many extra details. The Gospel is so short, in fact, that we have to sprinkle in some Gospel according to John throughout the course of the year, this weekend being one of them. Otherwise, the Gospel of Mark wouldn't last to the end of the year. The length of Mark's Gospel has led many biblical scholars to conclude that this was actually the first of the 4 Gospels to be put down on paper, or whatever method they were writing it. And there is some compelling evidence for this. When we look at the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, we see that nearly every word of Mark's Gospel, I think it's close to 70% of the words, are identical. They are contained in Luke and Matthew in their entirety, including the exact ordering of events, down to the exact wording, and a shockingly large number of the events in the life of Christ. And this has led biblical scholars to conclude that Mark's Gospel was written first, and that Matthew and Luke used the Gospel of Mark as part of their source material. Luke more or less admits to this at the very beginning of his Gospel, where he says this: "Many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the events, just as those who were eyewitnesses from the beginning and ministers of the word have handed them down to us. And so I have decided, after investigating everything accurately anew, to write it down in an orderly sequence for you. So in other words, at the beginning of Luke's gospel, he's saying that in writing, he aims to get the best sources in order to be the most accurate to the story. And in a bit, we'll see why Mark's gospel would have been such an excellent source for Luke to draw upon. So much so that he nearly copies the entire thing word for word. Didn't have copyright laws back then. But another piece of evidence that Mark's gospel came first is the simple fact that, being the shortest of the gospels, the reasoning goes that we usually add information to documents rather than take information away from them. So the first document is usually the shortest version. Sort of like the first version of this homily was almost only half as long as it is now. I always add a lot to it after the first draft. With that in mind, scholars have set a realistic date for the actual writing of Mark's gospel no later than the year 65 AD, which is pretty early on for a written gospel. I say written because we have to keep in mind that the spoken version of the gospel is way older than even that, dating back to the very first days of the church, when the apostles began preaching on Pentecost Sunday. The gospel was spread by word of mouth long before it was ever written down in the New Testament. So that's the date of Mark's gospel. Let's talk about the style that Mark's gospel was written in. And that kind of tells us a lot about the author. One thing that you'll notice about the Gospel of Mark as you're reading it is that it's written almost as if it were a series of news articles written down one next to the other. You have a description of an event and an occasional quote from someone involved in the event, and then it moves on, almost like you're reading a newspaper article to article. And what this tells us is that it was written down by an eyewitness who is summarizing the events as efficiently as possible. And they're acting as sort of like a news reporter, right? They are getting the facts down and the events involved and the things that were said and moving on to the next item. But the thing is that there's nobody named Mark in any of the Gospels. So how can he be acting as an eyewitness? How can he be acting as a reporter standing there on the sidelines if we don't hear anything about him? We have details about Jesus' life that involve only Jesus and one or two of his other disciples. So how can Mark be an eyewitness even in the most intimate exchanges between Jesus and his apostles? Who could he actually be? Well, fortunately, the Bible tells us exactly who Mark is. In fact, we know a lot about him from the Bible, and that knowledge comes to us from elsewhere in the New Testament. The Acts of the Apostles, for example, tells us that Mark, who is often referred to as John Mark in the Acts of the Apostles, he was the son of a wealthy woman living in Jerusalem who offered her house as basically one of the first churches. Back in the day, there were no church buildings. That wouldn't come about for centuries. And so the wealthier members of the Christian community would offer their homes to be used as churches. And Mark was a very early Christian, and he was brought up in this environment, in the center of Christianity in the first half of the first century. Acts of the Apostles also tells us that Mark was the nephew of Barnabas, who was one of St. Paul's travel companions on his missionary journeys. In fact, Mark himself accompanies Paul and Barnabas on one of their journeys, and in several of his letters, Paul mentions that Mark is with him in jail while he's awaiting his sentencing in Rome. So Mark is closely associated with Paul. We also know that Mark we know that Mark is from Jerusalem, essentially around the same time as the birth of Christianity itself, and we know that he was a close associate of St. Paul's, but does that explain how he knew so much about the life of Jesus? Well, not quite. We still haven't covered completely who Mark is. And once we do that, it'll be extremely clear why Mark's words are so important and so reliable. So if we fast forward a couple of decades after Mark's life, we have a church historian who was a bishop named Papias of Hierapolis. Great names back then. But Papias made it his life's work to collect. Papias died in around the year 160, so we're talking 130, 160, somewhere around there. So we're talking very, very, very early church. And Papias made it his life's work to collect and record as much information about the first days of the church as possible. And we owe him a lot of thanks for a lot of valuable information that we can't find in the Bible itself. Remember, the Bible's not meant to be a historical textbook. It's meant to be the Word of God. And so some things aren't in the Bible. And this is what he talks about when he's talking about the authors of the Gospel. He does have something to say about the Gospel of Mark, and he refers to an even older source from a man named John the Elder, who is likely either John the Apostle himself or one of John the Apostle's disciples. So the very beginning of the church, this is the information that he gathered. Mark, being the interpreter of Peter, whatsoever he remembered he wrote accurately, but not, however, in the order that these things were spoken or done by our Lord. For he neither heard the Lord nor followed him himself, but afterwards he was with Peter, who did not make a complete or ordered account of the Lord's words, but constructed his preaching according to concise, self-contained teachings. So Mark did nothing wrong in writing down single matters as he remembered them, for he gave special attention to one thing, of not passing by anything he heard, and not falsifying anything in these matters. So to summarize, this is pretty remarkable, right? Mark was Peter's personal assistant, his scribe. He was in charge of recording the oral speeches of Peter himself, and Papias says how exacting he was in the detail that Peter preached. Remember, Peter was a fisherman from the middle of nowhere. He likely couldn't read or write, or at least not very well. And Peter probably didn't sit down and give an hours-long testament of his time with Jesus. He was too busy focusing on preaching, right? He was a missionary. And so it makes sense for Peter to preach using these very short stories explaining different episodes in his time with Jesus. And that's exactly what we have with the Gospel of Mark. If you read the Gospel of Mark in its original Greek, it's very clear. It's just a bunch of short little sections stitched together that make one cohesive whole. It literally reads like this. And then Jesus did this, and then Jesus did that, and then Jesus said this, and then Jesus said that. About half of the sentences, I'm not even exaggerating, half of the sentences of Mark's Gospel begin with the words, and then, because Mark uses that phrase as a very simple transition to the next story that he has recorded from Peter's preaching. And he brings them into a cohesive whole. We can't be sure that the events of Mark's Gospel are in exactly the correct chronological order. Papias tells us that they were not. It's just Mark recorded them in this order based off of Peter's preaching. And it doesn't really matter in what order Jesus, performed this healing or that exorcism or whatever. What's important is that Peter witnessed these things and he preached about them. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And Mark wrote those things down. If you read the Gospel of Mark from this perspective, it makes a lot of sense. Mark's Gospel says nothing about the birth of Christ. It begins exactly where Peter came into the picture, with Jesus calling his disciples to himself. And Mark's Gospel it's the Gospel that is the most difficult towards Peter himself. It has the least number of nice things to say about Peter. And it goes out of its way to point out Peter's faults, probably because Peter was a rather humble man. This is what his preaching would have sounded like. And so it would make sense that Mark is in jail with Paul in Rome, because Peter was in jail in Rome with Paul. So they were all in Rome together. With that in mind, I want you to listen to a passage from St. Mark's Gospel. So to put yourself into the story, imagine that you're Peter, not Mark, witnessing these things. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him and stayed close to the sea. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came forward. Seeing him, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him, saying, "My daughter is at the point of death. Please come lay your hands on her, that she may get well and live." He went off with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed upon him. There was a woman afflicted with hemorrhages for 12 years. She had suffered greatly at the hands of many doctors and had spent all that she had. Yet she was not helped, but only grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. She said, "If I but touch his clothes, I shall be cured." Immediately her flow of blood dried up. She felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Jesus, aware at once that power had gone out from him, turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who has touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to him, "You see how the crowd is pressing upon you, and yet you ask, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done it. The woman, realizing what had happened to her, approached in fear and trembling. She fell down before Jesus and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace and be cured of your affliction." While he was still speaking, people from the synagogue official's house arrived and said, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" Disregarding the message that was reported, Jesus said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid, just have faith." He did not allow anyone to accompany him inside except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they arrived at the house, the synagogue official, he caught sight of a commotion. People were weeping and wailing loudly. So he went in and said to them, "Why is this commotion and weeping? The child is not dead but asleep." And they ridiculed him. Then he put them all out. He took along the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and entered the room where the child was. He took the child by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." The girl, a child of 12, arose immediately and walked around. At that they were utterly astounded. He gave strict orders that no one should know this, and said that she should be given something to eat. Okay, so that was a long story, but I wanted to get the full scope of kind of Mark's writing style. There's not a lot of and-thens in that story because the and-thens come from the original Greek, and the English kind of edits those things out. But anyways, if you piece the events together, that whole story could have happened in a matter of minutes, right? It starts out with Jesus finishing a journey crossing the Sea of Galilee by boat, and then Jesus meets Jairus, a synagogue official, who literally gets down on his knees to beg Jesus to heal his daughter. And on the way, the crowd presses in on him, and this woman comes up to him who's been suffering for many years, and there's so much going on that Jesus basically accidentally heals her. And then he goes to Jairus' house, and he argues with the people for a bit, and then he heals his daughter and has her fed. A lot happens in a short amount of time, and this fast pace all the time in the Gospel of Mark, you can practically imagine Mark frantically scribbling down notes as Peter is talking in his preaching, and so much so that you could probably attribute the length of Mark's Gospel to the fact that it's essentially the cliff notes of Peter's experiences, right? It doesn't mean that Mark's Gospel is in any way inferior, though. Mark will often begin a narration with Jesus doing something. In the middle of doing that one thing, he's interrupted and does another thing, and then he goes back and finishes that, which is what we just heard. And we have Jairus, and then the woman with the hemorrhages, and then Jairus' daughter again. And this happens so often in Mark's Gospel that Bible scholars often refer to this pattern as the Markan sandwich. Next time you read Mark's Gospel, look for these sandwiches. And it kind of gives a frenetic pace to Mark's Gospel that really gives the reader a sense that Jesus must have been completely overwhelmed, people coming up to him all the time, pulling him in all directions. And Peter was a witness to it all. So when you hear the words of St. Mark's Gospel throughout the course of this year, remind yourself that these are the actual words of Jesus' closest companion, St. Peter. Don't just skip over the Gospel of Mark because you can basically get the same exact words in the other Gospels, especially Luke and Matthew. These are the words of the man whom Jesus himself entrusted the care of the entire church. "You are Peter, and upon this rock I'll build my church." These are the words of the first pope. And so if ever there was a Gospel of St. Peter, this one is it.